So we have returned. The last lesson from your textbook is regarding the Congress of Vienna. It covers a tremendous amount of history, so I will do my best to not blabber on and to make it succinct and straightforward. Now, after Waterloo, England would mark this. There's three great victories in English history. First was the defeat of the Spanish Armada, where the Protestant wind developed this concept of English, not necessarily quite rationalism, but Protestantism, anti Catholicism sense of identity. Second was when they defeated Louis XIV. That was the Duke of Marlborough. And that placed England at least at the equal of France. And finally, is this victory of Waterloo. It stood for British orderliness, stability, and civilization against this madness of revolution and this reckless pursuit of glory by Napoleon. Now, the second time that Napoleon abdicated his throne, this time exiled to St. Helena, Louis XVIII again returns to the throne of France. This came to represent an end of the revolution and republican dreams. Even in Great Britain, radicals and some romantic writers mourned Waterloo as a victory of kings over people and a tragic end of an era of individual rights and republicanism. Since Napoleon's first fall from power, European diplomats had been meeting in Vienna, which I mentioned, to hammer out the contours of a new map of Europe. Representatives included those from small states, cities, religious communities. Every powerful family and powerful person throughout Europe was there. It's this magnificent ball filled with pageantry, all these people meeting to determine the future of Europe. And that they did. But honestly and realistically, this group was represented by the most powerful countries in Europe. And these powerful countries would hammer out a treaty that would dictate Europe and keep peace in Europe. It was actually, when you talk about successful treaties, it was a successful treaty that managed to keep peace through Europe through a generation until, say, 1848. Now, I'll play this on just a little bit. Yes, they tried to put the genie back in the bottle. So the Congress of Vienna is going to bring an era of conservative, anti-liberal, democratic, pro-monarchical, pro-nobility, pro-conservative era back to Europe. Can you put the genie back in the bottle? Now, I said that these European leaders met in Vienna, which is in Austria, to hammer out the peace treaty, and they had met before Napoleon's 100 Days. And I said it was a list of the who's and what's of Europe. Now, it was primarily the future is going to be determined by the major players. Now, this you will need to know. Who are the major players? First was this Russian Tsar that we know, Alexander the First. The second is an Austrian diplomat. He's not the emperor of the Austria. He's a diplomat, kind of like a secretary of state, and that's Metternich. Third was Casterlet. He was from England. And fourth was Frederick William III of Prussia. Now, France was not formally invited, as they normally wouldn't be there to determine the peace, but our good friend Talleyrand worked his way into the discussions. Now, all the countries in Europe wanted peace. The loss of life, these revolutionary ideas, these challenges to the status quo had become tired. In the territories of the empire, Some looked to dismantle these revolutionary innovations, others retained them. Now, the mood of the Vienna was opposed to revolution. That's what you need to know. The number one thing that they wanted to stop was revolution. All right, Metternich and Casterlet particularly wanted to restore the old order. So that would be Austria and Great Britain. Kings were restored to their thrones in Naples, Piedmont, those are both areas in Italy, Spain, and France. The territory of France was reduced way back to its 1789 boundaries, so we're right back to where we started before the revolution. This time, unlike the first time, France was forced to pay an indemnity of 700 million francs. Wellington, from Great Britain, and his troops occupied France for the next 3 years. Now, the big concept that comes out of this, and it's an old concept that the textbook will introduce because it's actually just formally recognized, and it's called the balance of power. And the balance of power of Europe was decided. And this is that the largest nations in Europe, so this would be Prussia, Austria, France, Great Britain, maybe Spain, and definitely Russia, which we were going to consider European, should not become so big and so powerful that they could dominate all of Europe. The goal of this is to prevent war. Much of Europe's history had been driven by one person seeing an opening to become the power in Europe and to call themselves the next heir to Rome, the next heir to the Holy Roman Empire. And now the interesting thing is this concept of a Europe is going to begin to emerge. All right, so when we talk about the European Union today, I mean, we have these nation states, but there's a sense of shared history, even though it's been violent throughout Europe, and it goes back to Rome, which controlled most of Europe, and they all have some type of common roots. So, if you look over your notes or the slides, Metternich himself distrusted these democratic ideals of the French Revolution. So just know the three main goals, all right, to prevent French aggression, which, this is what, 30 to 20 years of straight of war, all right, to restore the balance of power so no country could threat others, and to restore the old monarchies to the thrones of the former Napoleon Empire. If you look at the containment of France, a couple interesting things that will affect history, which we won't get to. The former Austrian Netherlands and Dutch republics. There were two separate areas. It was the Spanish Netherlands who lost. They lost the Spanish Netherlands in the War of Spanish Succession. It went to Austria. And the Dutch Republic were united to form the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So the Netherlands becomes a larger power to balance out the power of France and Great Britain. The 39 German states that were loosely joined, were loosely joined, so this is going to be more German states, I think, than what Napoleon had. And it created a new German confederation, which was dominated by Austria. Now, we're not going to get there, but who would control this future Germany? Would it be Austria or Prussia? In this period of time, Austria is the one much deeper rooted in history as a major power. So they get control over these states. Switzerland was recognized as an independent nation, and the Kingdom of Sardinia in Italy was strengthened by the addition of Genoa. Now, this is going to be important. Piedmont, Sardinia. All right, these changes enabled the countries of Europe to contain France and to prevent it from challenging Europe. And then Austria is going to do well on this treaty and gain other parts of Italy, which would lead to problems later on as well. Now, I covered a lot of these things in the last slide, so I'm not going to go over them too much. I went over the concept of the balance of power. Like I said, the treaty was still pretty favorable to France. Talleyrand was in people's ears and was able to prevent France from being punished too far or too much, because if the results of the treaty were too punitive towards France, France would either rebel or become so weak that another country would be able to control France. So it kept the balance of power, and I talked about the concept of legitimacy. I don't think I phrased it that way, but um, legitimacy just meant that the rulers who Napoleon had driven out to their thrones would be restored and given power. Now, how were they given legitimacy? One of the things that the Congress of Vienna created was the Concert of Europe, which is in the slide. And this was an agreement between the major powers that if any individual one faced any type of revolution, that they would um, aid each other to spell revolution. So if you think of what's going on here, enlightened ideals spread a counterculture argument against big monarchical government. And Rousseau's concept of an agreement not with a government or with a ruler, but with agreement between people to form a government, fueled the French Revolution. Now, this was very contrary to the historical use of power. The Concert of Europe is a group of old power getting together and making sure that they were going to maintain their power as this threat of individual rights and freedoms was beginning to coalesce. Now, it could seem critical that this is happening or that I'm critical of it happening, and I just think this is a natural occurrence. And what's going to happen is, in order to check those powers over the course of history, powers will have to slowly be given to at least some of the people so that the counterculture is not too strong to avoid a revolution. Now, that's going to be later because the Concert of Europe unites each of these nations against their people in many ways. But this was a political triumph. All right, for the first time, and I talked about the sense of a European identity, the nations of an entire continent had agreed on a certain political policy. It was fair to each country, so none of them had a grudge. And by agreeing to come to each other's aid in case of threats to what we'd say peace, I mean, I'm not sure that a popular rebellion would necessarily always indicate peace. European nations had ensured that there would be this balance of power. And it was a success because none of these five great powers waged war on one or another for nearly 40 years. And at the end of this era and the beginning of a new era would be the war in the Crimea, all right, which would be against the falling Turkish Empire on their eastern outskirts of Europe. So, and I keep saying, like, people forget about the horrors of these wars, and 40 years gives a generation enough time to forget about wars and look at these past wars from being horrific to glorifying them. Now, I kind of mentioned this before. The conservative are the forces of order, and the liberals are the forces of change. And the Congress of Vienna was a victory for the forces of order and the conservatives. Kings were restored to the power um, in each country according to Metternich's goals. But there were important differences between countries. Britain and France had constitutional monarchies, so that was more liberal. All right, they had a king, but the king was limited by the power of parliament. Generally speaking, the governments of Eastern Europe are more conservative. There's going to be a stronger peasant class. They are going to have stronger centralized power, less freedoms, more censorship, more secret police. And towards the West, there's going to be more of a demand for individual freedoms. Now, the conservatives in Europe, led by a man named Edmund Burke, I'm not sure if your textbook talks about them, they believe that tradition, and think about America today, right? Make America great again. Again, this is a conservative focus on the tradition of American politics. Religion, right? The Republican Party, the conservative party in America, is very tied to religious ideals. Right? They believed in divine monarchy, so a strong ruler that's not checked too much. Social order, on a natural hierarchy of kings over subjects, aristocrats over commoners, and fathers over families. Now, for the first time, these were not givens. I mean, this was just assumed to be correct. But they thought that these ideals held society together and kept society from venturing towards chaos. And they defended three positions: the centrality of religion, right, which underpinned this social cohesion and the morality of the world. That the world was governed by divine providence, not by reason. Remember that under Robespierre, they tried to get the cult of reason and defy religion and looked at religion as sentimental and superstitious. The second, that was tradition, were products of each nation's history, and these things should be conserved. Which is interesting today because as the United States expands, much like Napoleon did, and tries to spread our ideals throughout the world, there's a lot of talk that we're destroying other people's rights to local tradition, which is a big part of what we believe in ourselves. So it's like contradictory in nature. They thought that new constitutions produced individualism, and individualism would lead to chaos, which I mentioned, and the hierarchy of kings. Now, remember, this is, and I mentioned it in the last slide, rulers agreeing not to fight each other and to unite with each other on certain principles, but it's a conservative order of the rulers against their people. Somehow, as I was going over these slides, I returned to the genie back in the bottle concept. I'm turning into Costello right before my eyes, but I'm going to use this slide to talk about the forces of change. Now, we've seen the forces of change, and the forces of change during the revolution had a lot to deal with. So they wanted to preserve aspects of the revolution, which included constitutional monarchy, not the republic, civil liberties, a constitutional rule of law, and a representative government elected by men of property. So not the true egalitarian terror, everybody gets a vote and their vote is equal, but more of a system that the men who have an ownership of their country, right, not by being a citizen, but by owning property, should have ownership in that property's government. And this had backings of that middle class, the emerging middle class of bourgeoisie, of merchants, manufacturers, professionals, and the new bureaucratic class that is being created as governments are getting bigger, of civil servants. But they had an issue to deal with as far as how to uphold the ideals of the revolution while eliminating the terror and the chaos that was created and the violence by the authoritarianism of the revolution. So liberals are going to move more towards the middle, which is going to help, the conservative era. And they're going to emphasize a middle way between the radical democracy of the revolution and the return to the older hierarchies, tradition, and religious morality of the conservatives. They are going to defend the rights of people, the rule of law, freedom of the press, speech, and religion, as well the right to form associations or clubs. So they're going to have to set aside this quest for total democracy, as they're going to mistrust the lower classes, and they're going to blame that for the terror, and they're going to look for a middle ground. And the model of this middle ground is going to be seen as Great Britain or England. So while France is going to be left deeply divided, and Louis XVIII is going to be the constitutional monarch of France under a moderate constitution, there's still going to be this liberal undercurrent that is going to try to create a divide of power between the king and his people in France. And France is going to remain a hotbed of political dissent. So I always say, when France sneezes, the rest of Europe gets a cold. And over the period of the next 30 years, there'd be little bouts of revolution and individual rights that are going to spring up. And many, if not all of these times, it's going to begin in France, and it's going to begin in the center of discussion, If you don't know this answer right now, it's Paris. So despite the efforts to undo the French Revolution, the leaders of the Congress of Vienna ultimately could not turn back the clock, which gives you the question, is this concept of progress real? Are there certain ideals that we are evolving or moving towards that are fundamental towards the growth of our systems, of the political systems that we have instituted? I don't think this is a question that has been answered one way or another. I would say, even in my own mind, I don't know whether we are evolving or that we are just constantly cycling through periods of one forces of order, forces of change, and we're just funneling back and forth and kind of exchanging the same ideas. But this is one of the interesting. Now, I've briefly mentioned that France is going to be the hotbed of political dissent throughout this period of conservative order and alliance in Europe. Now, in France itself, then, like I said, with Great Britain, reestablished a constitutional monarchy. Louis XVIII was returned to power. And during this period of time, there is going to be a counterculture that is going to fight against this. And I think that this is either natural and necessary in history. I know this is the forces of change, forces of order just working at itself. It's the debate. It's almost natural. It happens in science as well. And Louis responds by more heavy censorship, new laws doubling the voting power of the richest men, and ultra royalists surging to the power in France. Now, originally, it's going to become a society based on class, and the middle class is going to grow, but it's going to move and venture more towards that old nobility. Now, the aristocratic power in France is going to grow even stronger when his younger conservative brother Charles X takes the throne of France. We probably won't get there in our course this year. And that's going to lead to even a more violent left-wing opposition underground, which one of the revolutionary societies that and it tends to be once opposition moves underground that the opposition becomes much more violent in nature. So the more that you try to suppress free speech, in general, that when free speech is asserted, it's in a much more violent way. And they were called the Carbonari, all right, which you may have heard of. And they were conspiring to overthrow the king. All right, so they were circulating literature and so on and so forth. I've talked about the conservatism and the liberals, and I'll talk a split second about Bonapartism. And this is going to be something that is changing over the course of time. But they're going to advocate Republican or liberal principles by increasing, all right, authoritarian rule by a strong man running a central state. Now, there's underpinnings of this in fascism and Leninism as you move forward in history is to enact some type of liberal reforms and to restore certain forms of tradition. You need to have a strong leader to transition this. This is going to become the dominant by the middle of the 19th century when his nephew, Louis Napoleon, stages a coup d'etat and reestablishes an empire in France, oddly enough. Early on, though, they were opposed to royalism, they hated privilege, and they celebrated social mobility. So many of the ideas of Napoleon, like that middle ground. And they are going to not necessarily be for the liberal Jacobinic, neo-Jacobinic liberal ideas. They're going to burn the tricolor flag and tear down things, but there's this idea of French pride and national glory that are always going to be tied to this revolution, and they're going to be under assault by the cult of this new conservative Metternich-ridden, Louis the 18th-ridden European/France. Right, all right. Now, usually I would go over this quickly, being that we would cover this later in the year, but as our year is quickly running to a close, I will go over the age of revolutions in one slide. So, Napoleon book began to circulate, the one that he wrote when he was sequestered on the island of Mount Helena. And it rewrites his history and presents him as a man that was both full of grandeur and also suffered, as he was a liberal reformer who attacks the noble hierarchy and clergy, especially in the Hundred Days. There's a lot of justification, and that he was a people's hero and that he was loved. Uh, and he's going to represent certain ideals that are going to spread. Now, in the late 18th century, the Enlightenment ideas and news of the American French Revolution had circulated in Latin America, and this is going to be the first place where there's going to be little outbursts of revolution. And you're going to actually learn about this, so I'm not going to go into it too deeply. But many Creole elites, they were mixtures of Spanish and people native to their land, viewed this disorder with apprehension. Um, Eventually, it's going to lead to the Haitian Revolution, and Spanish American elites are going to watch with horror. They're going to draw inspiration from the French, and there's going to be outbursts of revolution all throughout South America. That's going to lead to various movements for independence in the former South American colonies. In Europe, in 1830, there's harsh economic times, and I say when people can't eat, it usually leads to rebellions. And there's a series of rebellions that are going to happen, or revolutions that are going to happen. Um, I'm skipping over the ones in Greece, which were a little bit different. But there's going to be an early rebellion in Greece, or a revolution in Greece. That's going to be more against Ottoman rule, so that's going to be more cultural. There's going to be a second round in the 1830s. That the people of Paris are going to take part in this, and they're going to barricade in the streets. And Lafayette will emerge once again with the National Guard to take control. It's amazing how history repeats itself. And this is where Charles X flees, the conservative constitutional monarch, and liberal politicians are going to take charge. So every time there's a change of power in France, it's very violent. I mean, that's the beauty of the American Constitution, is in general throughout American history, we've had very peaceful transfers of power. They're going to put the king's cousin, Louis Philippe, on the throne, establish a new constitutional monarch, which would only last till 1848, when revolutions are going to break out once again, and they are going to begin in France and spread throughout the rest of Europe. Um, and again, they're going to try to institute a liberal republic, and they elect Napoleon's nephew, right, who's going to become eventually the emperor. 1848 becomes the year of revolution. So in this year, a series of revolutions are going to occur. Paris, Vienna, which is in Austria, Berlin, which is in Prussia, modern-day Germany, Budapest, which is in Hungary, Prague, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, Krakow, Milan, Palermo, Naples, Venice, that's parts of Italy, working class radicals and middle class rebels. So working class, and this is, at the time of Marxism, right? And middle class liberals are going to unite to try to create a new political order. So they're going to fight against this hierarchy, right? So the middle class initially are going to unite with the upper class and push for reform with the upper class. When that doesn't work, the middle class is going to unite with the lower class. So if you look in the United States, when reform is most likely going to happen, and if there's ever a fight against this conservative order, just watch the middle class. When the middle class is aligned with the upper class, it tends to be an era of conservative. When the middle class aligns with the lower classes, it tends to be periods of liberalism. So they're going to set up new constitutions. They want to redraw the map, and they want new nations to be formed. Remember that the spread of nationalism is going to be part of it. And new nations of Italy, loosely arranged, Germany, Hungary, and elsewhere. And peasants are going to rise up against their lords in Eastern Europe and press for common lands. They want their own property and lower taxes. Issues are going to include democracy, new constitutions, national unity. It's going to be tied to nationalism, and how to deal with the pervasive inequality. In France itself, all right, the revolution is going to take on a very similar bent as it did the first time around. Conservatives are going to watch with dread, Metternich eventually sees the writing on the wall and is actually forced to flee Austria, where the revolutions are much more extreme and they're going to need Russia's help to quell the revolution, and new liberal reforms are going to be instituted. Okay, that is the bottom line. I'm not going to go into much of the rest of it. Okay, I kind of brushed across all this, so I'm not really going to go over this slide. Make sure that you study this slide and you know this slide, the long-term legacy of the Congress of Vienna, which will last for the next 100 years. And then there's going to be another shift in power as well. You can see that in 1848, just know that there's this period of time between this push-pull between some of these liberal principles of the revolution and conservative principles that were trying to keep in check by the Congress of Vienna. 1848, there's a liberal principles that react, and what the governments end up doing is adopting some of them, including the idea of nationalism, which is going to be moved from being tied to a force of change to actually a force of order, and rulers are going to co-opt nationalism into their policies to bring adherence to the forces or the that are running the countries. But just know some of these legacies. Congress of Vienna is very important, and it's actually been talked about today. I'm not really going to get into the politics of it, but I hope you guys thought that this was interesting. I know my lectures have been a little bit hit or miss, and